Hi, I'm Elizabeth, this is the Bookish North, and today I'll be talking about 7 history books that I read somewhat recently. 5 of them I read for the History Challenge, which was a readathon taking place the last 2 weeks of August, so I will leave links to that down below. I am aware of the fact that I'm very late in wrapping that up, but who cares? I've read the books and I want to talk about them, so here we are. I've also read 2 more since that fits the same topic, so I'm gonna lump them in here as well. And you know what? It is still somewhat topical because we are, after all, in the midst of non-fiction November, and all of these books are non-fiction books. So let's get started. First off, I wanted to mention 2 very briefly because they were very short audiobooks and don't have all that much to say about them. The first of which was Korea, a very short introduction written by Michael J. Seth and read by Paul Heitch. So this is part of the series of a very short introduction books, and it is exactly what it sounds like by the title. It is a very brief introduction to Korean history. So it's, you know, complete surface level, just key events and dates and stuff that has happened over a long period of time. It was a 4-hour audiobook, and I did feel like it was a very easy to listen to. It was it gave exactly what I expected it to, and it was accessible and it was easy to grasp. And I really enjoy, when I'm going into something new, to start off with something like that, because it makes it so much easier later on to have a context to attach new pieces of information to. So this is something I did quite often as a student when going into something new, either finding sort of a very short introduction kind of book, or a Your Topic for Dummies book, or just a Wikipedia article that summarizes something at the complete surface level, because it does make it so much easier when you're trying to place new pieces of information into a puzzle when you sort of have the framework. So that's a study tip for you to start this off. The other very short book was called Nimrud, The History and Legacy of the Ancient Assyrian City. I don't really know who wrote it because it doesn't say, it just says it's by Charles River Editors, which is the publisher, but it was read by Colin Fluxman. And this again was just a brief overview of the things we know about the ancient city of Nimrud, that was at one point the capital of the Assyrian Empire, and found it interesting. And what I particularly enjoyed about this book was that it had a fair amount of quotes from contemporary cuneiform sources, and I always enjoy reading that. So both of these books were sort of exactly what I expected them to be. I found them interesting. They weren't any kind of amazing writing or anything like that, but they're not supposed to be, and they completely delivered on what they promised to. So the first book I finished for the History Challenge was a short history of the world according to sheep by Sally Coulthard, narrated by Karen Cass. And this is a book I would describe both as a micro history and as a macro history, because it's micro because it looks into one specific thing, namely sheep through history, and mainly human relations to sheep during history and how that has changed. But it also touches upon many branches within academics, so it's also sort of a macro history because it looks at a grand scheme of time, and it looks at different kinds of sciences in relation to this one topic. I did find this very interesting. I mean, if you know a lot about sheep, this book will probably not give you a lot of new information, but I have to say I didn't know all that much about sheep going into it, and I probably knew most about the oldest pieces of information in here, because it starts off with talking about how or when sheep were domesticated and how they were originally used for the purposes of meat and milk, and how that changed to be mainly for wool production later on. And we learn a lot about the different attributes of wool and the different ways wool have been processed over time and at different places on the planet. We learn about how important it has been for the development of certain civilizations, and we also learn about how the textile industry was a driving force behind the Industrial Revolution, and we learn about how keeping sheep has changed the geography of the planet, and how keeping sheep has had different kinds of implications in how we live. It also touches upon things like myths and legends and language. It goes into science and, the cloning of the sheep dolly, and lots of other different things. So I found this very interesting. It doesn't really go in depth into any of these things, but it gives a nice overview. It was very accessible, and I would certainly say that this is the kind of book that you can really enjoy even if you don't normally read a lot of non-fiction. It was very engagingly written, so I really enjoyed this. And the second book I read for the History Challenge was a completely different kind of book. It's called Wandering in Strange Lands, A Daughter of the Great Migration Reclaims Her Roots by Morgan Jerkins, and this audiobook was narrated by the author herself. So this is sort of a mix between memoir and history writing. She starts off with her own situation, how she is a black woman who has grown up in the northern parts of the US, but her family, as many other black families, have roots in the south, and they traveled north during the period called the Great Migration. And so she wants to learn more about her family's history, what happened during that time, and how things might have been different for her if they had stayed in the south. Her father's family stayed in the south, and her mother's came north. I have a very limited knowledge of US history. I know, some of the main events or dates or whatever, but I know very little of the stories behind it. I've realized that my history reading has been very focused on either the ancient Near East or Europe. So that's something that I'm lacking, and it's something I felt I was lacking when I was reading this book, because I feel like this is a book that sort of challenges the more canonical history writing in many ways, and it brings more nuance to the table. But it's hard for me to say if it actually does that, because I don't really know the canonical history writing. If you have one book that gives a very nice overview of US history to recommend me, please do so in the comment section. But my reason for saying that I feel like this is a book that challenges the canonical history writing is because Morgan Jerkins herself is surprised by a lot of the things that she finds when she goes exploring, and she has her sort of preconceptions or prejudice going into this that she discusses and presents to us. So it feels like a very honest book, and then she travels to the south and she meets a lot of people, and then all of the time she learns that the situation is more complex than she thought going into it, and it becomes a more nuanced picture of the whole story. So there was a lot of interesting things here about the everyday life of Creoles. It was interesting about the relationships between black people and the Native Americans throughout history. And there were just lots of these little nuggets of information that were completely new to me. And I think they would be new to a lot of other people as well, because they were also new to Morgan Jerkins herself. So I really enjoyed the way this book was written, how she used her personal experience and how she traveled and met people, and how open she was to change her own views on the things she encountered. So this is a book I would recommend, but I think you would enjoy it most if you already knew more about US history than I knew going into this. I did a bit of Googling and reading basic Wikipedia articles and stuff alongside this, because there were some things that were taken for granted that I knew more of than I actually did. But this book in itself was well written. It felt very honest, and it felt like a book that, as I said, gave a lot more nuance to topics that I think is treated more like black and white, sort of, in the more canonical writing. Like, it is this thing, and then there's a lot of grey areas around it, if you know what I mean. Then I have the 2 physical books I read for the readathon, and here I'm more on home turf again. So the first of those were Women in the Viking Age by Judith Jesch. This is described as the first full-length book survey of women in the Viking Age written in English, and this was first published in the early 1990s, and then this is a revised edition from 2001, but it's still not really a new book. So this is a topic I have read a fair amount about, and yet this book still managed to both give me new information and to see some information I maybe already knew in a sort of different light. So this was probably my favorite book, well, of all the ones I'm gonna talk about here today. So I thought going into this that it might be a bit dry because this is academic writing, but it wasn't. I mean, it is definitely a very fact-heavy book, but it's written in a very accessible way, and it doesn't really presuppose a lot of knowledge about the Viking Age, even though I would say it would help if you had some, you know, some kind of overview of the most canonical writing about the Viking Age, because this is a book that sort of aims to fill in the gaps, because the canonical history writing about the Vikings mainly focuses on men. And so this manages to broaden that picture by including, you know, the other half of the population as well. So in this book she goes through various kinds of sources very systematically. She starts off with the one she deems most trustworthy, and then ends with the one she deems least trustworthy. So she starts off with archaeology and what findings from graves and stuff can tell us. She then goes on to discuss runic inscriptions, which are contemporary written sources from Scandinavia itself. Then she goes on to discuss other written sources from outside of Scandinavia that were contemporary to the Vikings. And then she goes on with the Poetic Edda, the poems in Poetic Edda and what they can tell us, and also the Prose Edda. And then finally she discusses the Icelandic sagas that she deems to be not very trustworthy as far as allowing us to know what it was like in the 700s and 800s, because they were written down so much later that she feels they tell us more about the situation of the time they were written in than the time they are describing. There are sort of 2 differing points on that, but that's definitely her side of it. And I felt like this was a very well organized book. It had lots of information and it felt very comprehensive. It's certainly a book to recommend if you want to learn more about women in the Viking Age. I sort of skimmed a bit of the section where she was going through some of the written sources, like the Prose Edda and stuff, because I have read those stories so many times, and she was mainly recounting the stories, but then she went on to discuss the meaning behind them, and then I was all there for. So this was a very good book. I found a lot of valuable information in here. I found it super interesting. After finishing that, I was not quite ready to say goodbye to the Viking world, so I picked up the other Viking book on my TBR, which is called The Black Viking by Bergsveinn Birgisson. In my TBR video I said I thought this was translated from Icelandic. Turns out it isn't. I mean, the author is Icelandic, but he is living and working in Norway, and this was his first book that was actually published in Norwegian. But I guess more interesting to most of you guys, it is also translated into English, so it is available to anyone to read. And this was a very, very different kind of book. I mean, Birgisson is also an academic. He is a philologist, so he's working with the written texts. But he's also a author of novels, and in this book he sort of mixes those two things, because he's telling the story about one particular Viking, and he's a Viking that is hardly mentioned in the written sources at all. So Birgisson has spent a decade trying to create this story of this particular Viking called Geirmund Heljarskin, which means Geirmund the Black-Skinned. So he starts off from the actual mention of him in some other people's sagas. There was never written a saga about him, even though he was described in the Landnoma book, the book that writes about the first inhabitants of Iceland, and which is deemed to be fairly historically accurate, because it mainly just mentions the people that moved there and their family trees and stuff like that. And so he's mentioned there as one of the first people to come to Iceland and one of the richest and most powerful men, yet he is hardly visible in the sagas, and he does not have a saga of his own. So this is sort of Birgisson's attempt of writing the saga of Geirmund Heljarskin. So as I said, he starts off with the written sources, what we know, and then he fills in with what we know from other sources, and then he's also including stuff that's archaeological stuff and things we know from various other sources that are not specifically related to the Vikings, but a lot of Russian studies, and also a lot of stuff from Dublin, where Geirmund was also present for quite a few years. And what he has managed to do is create a story that is, it reads partly like a detective story of him trying to find out more about Geirmund's story. So in that kind of way, this almost reads like crime fiction, trying to solve a mystery. And it's very, very engagingly written. It's certainly a book that you can enjoy without having read any kind of non-fiction before this, because it is sort of a crossover. It's partly novel-ish, and then partly a detective story about his real-life struggle of creating this picture of this particular Viking. But then where the sources just doesn't give him enough information, he goes on to fictionalize, basically, and he tells, based on the sources, this is the likely way things might have happened. And in those parts, you know, the people in the story gains personalities and becomes people. And this is sort of the way the sagas were written, because the saga writers are assumed to be collectors of history, knowing a lot of different things that maybe are lost to us now, but where they didn't know, or where the facts maybe didn't fit the story they wanted to tell, they have created these works of literature that are the sagas. So in a way, Bergsveinn Birgisson is trying to create the saga of this Viking who didn't have any. And the story he tells is very engaging. It is also, it feels likely, and it is never unclear whether what he is writing is based on evidence or, you know, facts, or if it is his assumptions. It is always very clear, unlike in the sagas where he is going off in his own head. But yeah, the story he tells is very compelling, and it is definitely it feels very likely based on all of his findings. So this is a book that won the Brageprisen in Norway, which is the highest literary prize in Norway, and I can definitely see why. It makes history writing super accessible and super exciting, and it was interesting. I would say at some points it does feel a tad macho in the writing, and I think that is probably, if not to be expected, but it is quite common when writing about Vikings. And the females aren't exactly very present in this story. But I mean, this is sort of the biography of a man, so he is the focal point for everything going on here. And I did find it interesting to hear Birgisson's thoughts on why his story wasn't told, why there is no saga about this man. And so this is certainly a book that corrects history writing as well, or gives us other options than what the more canonical history writing lets us know. The last book I wanted to mention is the last of these that I finished. It's called When Women Rule the World, written by Cooney, and she also narrated the audiobook herself. This is a book depicting 6 queens of Egypt. These are women that rose to the pinnacle of power in the ancient world, and this is something we don't see anywhere else other than in Egypt. So Cooney sort of argues why this happened in Egypt and not in any of the other sort of empires or kingdoms that were contemporary to Egypt, that Egypt was in contact with. So why was it possible then? And then she draws sort of comparisons to many US politics today, and how it is still very hard for women to be in power today. So I definitely enjoyed the parts where she was talking about ancient history the most, where she was sort of describing the life and reign of these queens, how they came to be in power, what they did with the power, and how it ended for them. And for most of these women we have very little source material, so she's sort of stretching it as far as she can get away with. There was a lot of she must have felt, she must have done in this book, so she definitely goes beyond what we can actually know of their lives. For some of them we mainly just know they existed and that they were a queen. Not just a queen, she argues that they were king in their own right, sort of because a queen is attached to a king, but they were sort of the one who called all the shots at some point or another. Some because they were sort of a queen regent before their son came of age and could rule in his own name, and some of them actually ruled without a male counterpart present at all. So the 6 queens mentioned are Mernith, Neferusobek, Hatshepsut, Nefertiti, Tawasarat, and Cleopatra. I'd heard of 3 of these before, Hatshepsut, Nefertiti, and Cleopatra, even though I didn't know all that much about their lives, and then the 3 others were new to me. So I did find this super interesting. I did feel like it was slightly speculative at times, because she's trying to talk about what these women must have felt and thought, and we have absolutely no way of knowing that, but it is clear that it is her assumption. She's not presenting it as facts. But yeah, I certainly learned a lot about Egyptian history. I would say that her argument that Egypt was so sort of progressive because they allowed women to have these positions of power frequently falls somewhat flat in the fact that there are 6 women in about 3,000 years. I'm not sure I would agree that that is frequently, but it was at least possible, unlike most other empires. So, I mean, it's not completely wrong to say that. And then I feel like the parts where she's trying to draw parallels to contemporary politics is a lot weaker, because she doesn't really bring anything new to the table. I feel like the points she's making are very obvious points that anybody already knows. And I also feel like they were very US centered, about how it is impossible sort of for a woman to have that highest point of power. And that feels somewhat wrong to me, living in Scandinavia and living in a country where the Prime Minister currently is a woman. So clearly here it is possible to get that highest position even as a woman, even if it is much less common than it being occupied by a man. So overall, I enjoyed it. It wasn't like a 5-star read for me. It was okay, and I learned some new things. But I think I would probably have enjoyed it more if it were a somewhat more neutral book, and not putting in quite as much of her own sort of assumptions and interpretations of events. But it's okay if you have something else to balance it against. So I think I'm going to get more into ancient Egypt in times to come. So that was all of the books. I feel like I'm very rusty. I haven't been making a lot of videos this year because it's 2020. I mean, let's use that excuse for everything. But I have really enjoyed all of these books. I've been on the history challenge set me on a complete history binge, and I'm still sort of partly there. Yeah, I'm currently enjoying Nonfiction November. I've finished my first book and I'm very close to finishing my second, and I'm actually following my TBR this time, which is somewhat unusual for me. So yeah, happy with my reading at the moment. I hope you are as well, and I'll talk to you soon.